The First World War remains the defining catastrophe of the 20th century. The moment when the old world died and the modern age was born in blood and fire. It destroyed empires and created nations. It killed millions and wounded civilizations. It shattered illusions about progress and rationality. It demonstrated humanity's capacity for both heroism and horror. In Flanders fields, where poppies grow, the dead lie in their graves, silent witnesses to the war that was supposed to end all wars, but instead became the first chapter of an even darker story. We remember them, not with glory, but with sorrow, honoring their sacrifice while mourning its necessity. May we learn from their example and from the failures that sent them to their deaths, to build a more peaceful world. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. Peace. The end. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns finally fell silent across the Western Front. After 4 years, 3 months, and 1 week of unprecedented carnage, the Great War, the war that was supposed to end all wars, came to an end. But the silence came too late for the nearly 10 million soldiers who had already perished, and the 21 million who bore the scars of battle. Too late for the millions of civilians who died from starvation, disease, and violence. Too late for an entire generation whose youth was consumed in the mud of Flanders, the mountains of Italy, and the deserts of Mesopotamia. The First World War transformed the world in ways that still echo through our present day. It toppled 4 great empires, redrew the map of Europe and the Middle East, and set the stage for even greater conflicts to come. It was the first truly modern war. A war of machine guns and poison gas, of tanks and aircraft, of nations mobilizing every resource toward total victory. But how did it begin? How did the most advanced civilizations on Earth, at the height of human progress and prosperity, plunge themselves into such catastrophic violence? To understand the Great War, we must first understand the world that created it. A world of empires and ambitions, of ancient rivalries and modern anxieties, a world balanced precariously on the edge of a knife. This is the story of that world and how it tore itself apart. In the summer of 1914, Europe stood at the pinnacle of global power and influence. The continent dominated world trade, controlled vast colonial empires spanning every continent, and led humanity in science, industry, and culture. Preceding decades had seen extraordinary progress. Electric lights illuminated great cities. Telephones connected distant corners of nations, and railways carried goods and people at speeds unimaginable to previous generations. This world was ruled by emperors and kings, many of them related by blood. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was the grandson of Britain's Queen Victoria. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia was Wilhelm's cousin and married to another of Victoria's granddaughters. The crowned heads of Europe addressed each other as Willie, Nicky, and Georgie, exchanging friendly telegrams and vacationing together at family gatherings. Yet beneath this veneer of civilized stability, powerful forces were reshaping the European order. 5 great powers dominated the continent. The British Empire, upon which the sun never set, controlled a quarter of the world's population and territory. The French Republic, still recovering from its defeat by Prussia in 1870, maintained the world's second-largest colonial empire. The German Empire, unified only in 1871, had rapidly become Europe's industrial powerhouse and sought what its leaders called a place in the sun. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, a patchwork of 11 nationalities and 16 languages, struggled to hold together in an age of rising nationalism. And the Russian Empire, stretching from Poland to the Pacific, combined the autocratic rule of the czars with rapid industrialization and seething social tensions. The Second Industrial Revolution had transformed these nations into economic and military giants. Germany's coal and steel production rivaled Britain's. France had recovered economically from its defeat and modernized its military. Even backward Russia was beginning to industrialize at a dramatic pace. This industrial might translated directly into military power. Larger armies, equipped with deadlier weapons than the world had ever seen. So too did the potential for catastrophic conflict. The 2 decades before 1914 saw a series of international crises over Morocco, over the Balkans, over naval armaments, each resolved at the last moment, but each leaving deeper resentments and stronger preparations for the next confrontation. European nations poured resources into arms races, building vast conscript armies and mighty battleship fleets. Military spending soared. General staffs drew up elaborate war plans. And with each crisis averted, confidence grew that war, if it came, would be swift and decisive. A matter of weeks, not years. But there were warning voices. Some observers recognized that modern industrial warfare would be nothing like the brief conflicts of the 19th century. The American Civil War and the Russo-Japanese War had offered glimpses of the terrible, destructive power of modern weapons. Yet these warnings went largely unheeded. The great powers of Europe, confident in their strength and convinced of their righteousness, marched steadily toward catastrophe. The road to world war was paved with alliances, agreements meant to preserve peace, that instead ensured that any local conflict would engulf the entire continent. The alliance system that would prove so deadly in 1914 had its roots in the diplomatic revolution of the 1890s. For 2 decades after German unification, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had maintained peace through a complex system of alliances designed to isolate France and prevent a 2-front war. Germany allied with Austria-Hungary and maintained friendly relations with Russia, while keeping France diplomatically isolated. But Bismarck's carefully balanced system required a skilled hand, and when the young Kaiser Wilhelm II dismissed him in 1890, that balance began to unravel. Wilhelm's aggressive foreign policy and his determination to build a navy that could rival Britain's alarmed the other European powers. When Germany allowed its treaty with Russia to lapse, France seized the opportunity. In 1894, France and Russia formed an alliance. Germany's nightmare of potential enemies on two fronts had become reality. But the most significant shift came when Britain abandoned its traditional splendid isolation and began seeking continental allies. Alarmed by Germany's naval buildup and colonial ambitions, Britain reconciled with France in 1904 in the Entente Cordiale, resolving colonial disputes in Africa and establishing closer diplomatic cooperation. 3 years later, Britain reached a similar agreement with Russia, creating what became known as the Triple Entente. Europe now stood divided into two armed camps. On one side, the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, though Italy's commitment was questionable. On the other, the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain, whose agreements were less formal but increasingly solid. These alliances transformed Europe into a powder keg. Any spark in one region could ignite a continental conflagration. The alliance system interlocked with elaborate military mobilization plans that reduced diplomatic flexibility in times of crisis. Russia's mobilization plan required deploying troops against both Germany and Austria-Hungary simultaneously. Germany's Schlieffen Plan called for a rapid strike through Belgium to defeat France before turning east against Russia. These plans operated like clockwork mechanisms. Once set in motion, they were nearly impossible to stop. Moreover, the great powers had extended their rivalries into the Balkans, a region seething with nationalist tensions. Austria-Hungary, fearful of Slavic nationalism, threatening its multinational empire, aligned with Germany. Russia positioned itself as the protector of Slavic peoples and Orthodox Christians, bringing it into conflict with Austria-Hungary. France and Britain watched nervously as crises in this volatile region threatened to drag them into unwanted conflicts through their alliance obligations. Contemporary observers often depicted the alliance system as a set of chains binding Europe together, or as dominoes waiting to fall. These metaphors would prove tragically accurate. The alliances meant to deter war by threatening any aggressor with overwhelming opposition would instead ensure that a regional conflict in southeastern Europe would become a world war. If the alliance system created the conditions for world war, the Balkans provided the spark. This mountainous region in southeastern Europe, where the Ottoman Empire had ruled for centuries, was fragmenting along ethnic and religious lines. As Ottoman power waned, nationalist movements sought to create new states or expand existing ones, while the great powers maneuvered for influence in the power vacuum. The Ottoman Empire, once a formidable power that had threatened Vienna itself, was now dismissed as the sick man of Europe. Its territory in the Balkans had been steadily eroding since the early 19th century. Greece, Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria had all gained independence or autonomy, often after bloody conflicts. Each new crisis raised the specter of great power intervention and possible war. In 1908, Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, which it had occupied since 1878. This move infuriated Serbia, which saw Bosnia's large Slavic population as part of a future Greater Serbia. It also humiliated Russia, which had been forced to accept the annexation without gaining anything in return. The crisis passed without war, but it left deep resentments and emboldened Austria-Hungary's hardliners, who believed they could act in the Balkans without consequences. Then came the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, conflicts that served as a dress rehearsal for the greater catastrophe to come. In the First Balkan War, Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, and Montenegro allied to drive the Ottomans almost entirely out of Europe. In the Second Balkan War, the victors turned on each other over the spoils, with Bulgaria fighting against its former allies, plus Romania and the Ottomans. Serbia emerged from these wars nearly doubled in size, confident in its military prowess and increasingly aggressive in promoting South Slav nationalism. This terrified Austria-Hungary's leaders, who saw Serbian ambitions as an existential threat to their multinational empire. If Slavs in Bosnia, Croatia, and Slovenia sought union with Serbia, the empire would disintegrate. Serbian nationalist fervor found its most extreme expression in secret societies like the Black Hand, founded in 1911 by Serbian military officers. These groups were dedicated to creating a greater Serbia by any means necessary, including terrorism and assassination. They received covert support from elements within the Serbian government and military, though the Serbian leadership also feared these extremists were pushing the country toward a catastrophic war with Austria-Hungary. In Vienna, Austria-Hungary's military leadership, particularly Chief of Staff Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf, repeatedly urged a preventive war against Serbia before it became too powerful. The elderly Emperor Franz Joseph, who had ruled since 1848, resisted these calls, but his authority was waning. The Austro-Hungarian government faced a dilemma: act decisively against Serbia and risk Russian intervention, or do nothing and watch the empire's authority erode in the Balkans. By the spring of 1914, the Balkans were a tinderbox waiting for a match. Nationalist passions ran high. Great powers backed rival factions. Military leaders on all sides believed war was inevitable and perhaps desirable. All that was needed was an incident, a crisis that would force decisions that leaders had so far avoided. That incident would come in late June in the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo, in the form of a terrorist attack that would change the world forever. June 28, 1914, dawned bright and warm in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The date held deep significance. It was Vidovdan, St. Vitus's Day, the anniversary of the 1389 Battle of Kosovo, a sacred date in Serbian national consciousness. On this day, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, would visit the city with his wife, Sophie, in a display of imperial authority. Franz Ferdinand was an unlikely martyr. A stern, authoritarian figure, he had few admirers even in Vienna. His marriage to Sophie, a Czech countess of insufficient rank, had been morganatic. Their children could not inherit the throne. Yet the Archduke harbored plans to reform the empire, possibly by granting greater autonomy to Slavic peoples, a prospect that Serbian nationalists saw as threatening their own ambitions for a greater Serbia. A group of 6 young Bosnian Serb assassins had positioned themselves along the route of the Archduke's motorcade. Armed with pistols and bombs supplied by the Black Hand organization, these teenagers and young men were prepared to sacrifice their lives for their nationalist cause. Their leader, Gavrilo Princip, was just 19 years old, dying of tuberculosis and consumed with romantic notions of martyrdom and liberation. The first attempt failed when one conspirator threw a bomb at the Archduke's car, but it bounced off and exploded beneath the following vehicle, wounding several officers and bystanders. Remarkably, the motorcade continued to the town hall, where Franz Ferdinand, visibly shaken and angry, complained that, "So, you welcome me here with bombs." After the reception, the Archduke insisted on visiting the wounded officers in the hospital, a decision that sealed his fate. Through a combination of confusion, bad luck, and poor security, the Archduke's driver took a wrong turn onto Franz Joseph Street, where Gavrilo Princip happened to be standing outside a delicatessen. When the driver stopped to reverse, Princip stepped forward and fired 2 shots from just 5 feet away. One bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck. The other hit Sophie in the abdomen. Within minutes, both were dead. News of the assassination spread rapidly across Europe, yet the initial reaction was surprisingly muted. Political murders were not uncommon. Just 14 years earlier, an anarchist had assassinated Italy's king. Few imagined that this latest outrage would trigger a world war. Kaiser Wilhelm left for his planned Norwegian vacation. Many officials assumed the crisis would pass like others before it. But in Vienna, a hardline faction saw the assassination as the perfect opportunity to crush Serbia once and for all. Led by Foreign Minister Leopold Berchtold, and with strong support from the military, these officials convinced the aging emperor, Franz Joseph, that decisive action was necessary. The investigation quickly established links between the assassins and Serbian military intelligence, providing the justification Vienna sought. The crucial question was whether Germany would support Austria-Hungary in a confrontation with Serbia, knowing that Russia would likely intervene on Serbia's behalf. On July 5 through 6, Austrian officials traveled to Berlin to seek what became known as Germany's blank check, outraged by the murder of a fellow monarch, and convinced that Russia was bluffing, assured Austria-Hungary of full German support regardless of Russian reaction. With German backing secured, Vienna deliberately crafted an ultimatum designed to be rejected. Presented to Serbia on July 23 with a 48-hour deadline, the ultimatum contained 10 demands, some reasonable, others, particularly the demand that Austrian officials participate directly in the investigation on Serbian soil, clearly intended to violate Serbian sovereignty. Serbia's response, delivered just before the deadline on July 25, accepted most of the Austrian demands but rejected the clause allowing Austrian officials to operate on Serbian territory. Serbia also ordered mobilization and evacuated the government from Belgrade. The response was conciliatory enough that Kaiser Wilhelm, returning from vacation, believed it removed any reason for war and urged restraint. But the war machinery was already in motion. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28. Russia, committed to defending Serbia and seeing this as a test of its great power status after earlier Balkan humiliations, ordered partial mobilization on July 29 and full mobilization on July 30. Germany demanded Russia halt mobilization. When this demand was refused, Germany declared war on Russia on August 1. France, bound by its alliance with Russia, began mobilization. Germany, implementing the Schlieffen Plan, demanded free passage through Belgium to attack France. Belgium refused, and Germany declared war on France on August 3rd, invading Belgium the same day. Britain committed to Belgian neutrality by an 1839 treaty and, alarmed by German aggression, sent an ultimatum demanding German withdrawal from Belgium. When this expired without reply, on August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. In just 5 weeks, a single act of terrorism in an obscure Balkan city had plunged all of Europe's great powers into war. Massive crowds gathered in Berlin, Paris, Vienna, and London to cheer the war declarations, convinced that their side was in the right and that the war would be brief and glorious. Few imagined the catastrophe that awaited them. The bloodiest conflict in human history had begun. The first weeks of August 1914 witnessed the most massive military mobilization the world had ever seen. Across Europe, millions of men received mobilization notices, kissed their families goodbye, and reported to railway stations to join their regiments. The great powers had planned meticulously for this moment, creating railway timetables that could move entire armies to the frontiers with industrial efficiency. The mood in August 1914 was one of euphoric patriotism. In Berlin, Paris, Vienna, London, and St. Petersburg, vast crowds filled the streets, singing patriotic songs and shouting support for their rulers and armies. Young men rushed to enlist, fearing the war would be over before they saw combat. Artists, intellectuals, and poets celebrated the war as a spiritual renewal, a cleansing fire that would burn away the decadence and materialism of modern life. Both sides were supremely confident of quick victory. German soldiers departed with messages chalked on their railway cars, "See you in Paris." French troops, wearing their traditional red trousers and blue coats, were told they would be in Berlin in 6 weeks. British propaganda emphasized that the British Expeditionary Force would teach the Germans a lesson and be home by Christmas. Russian generals spoke of crushing Germany and liberating their Slavic brothers in Austria-Hungary. But beneath the optimism lay rigid war plans that would doom millions. Germany's Schlieffen Plan, named for its architect, former Chief of Staff Alfred von Schlieffen, called for the bulk of German forces to sweep through Belgium and northern France in a great wheeling movement, encircling Paris and the French armies before they could fully mobilize. Only light forces would defend in the east against Russia, whose slow mobilization would give Germany time to defeat France before turning east. Everything depended on speed and precise execution. On August 4th, German forces crossed the Belgian frontier, beginning the violation of Belgian neutrality that would bring Britain into the war. The Belgians, their small army no match for the German war machine, nonetheless fought back with unexpected determination. The fortress city of Liège, which German plans assumed would fall in 2 days, held out until August 16th, disrupting the invasion timetable. German frustration at Belgian resistance led to harsh reprisals against civilians. In towns like Dinant, Louvain, and Andenne, German troops executed civilians accused of Franc-Tireur attacks, civilian resistance, and burned large portions of the towns. The ancient library of Louvain, with its priceless medieval manuscripts, went up in flames. These atrocities provided powerful propaganda for the Allies and helped solidify support for the war, particularly in Britain and neutral nations. France, meanwhile, launched its own offensive according to Plan 17, which called for immediate attacks into Alsace-Lorraine, the provinces lost to Germany in 1871. French generals, influenced by the doctrine of offensive spirit, the belief that moral elan could overcome defensive firepower, sent their troops forward in dense formations. German machine guns and artillery cut them down in droves. In the first month of the war, France suffered over 300,000 casualties, including an entire generation of officers in their distinctive white gloves and bright uniforms. The Battle of the Frontiers, a series of engagements along the Franco-German border in mid-August, proved catastrophic for French arms. Everywhere, the German army advanced, while French and British forces fell back in disorder. Paris seemed doomed. The French government prepared to evacuate to Bordeaux. Refugees streamed south, clogging the roads and spreading panic. The British Expeditionary Force, about 100,000 professional soldiers, small by continental standards but superbly trained, took up positions on the left of the French line near the Belgian town of Mons. On August 23, they encountered the advancing German First Army. Though heavily outnumbered, British rifle fire was so rapid and accurate that German troops believed they were facing machine guns. But the BEF, like the French, was forced to retreat as German armies pressed forward on a broad front. By the last week of August, the Schlieffen Plan seemed to be working. German armies had advanced deep into France, covering up to 20 miles a day despite fierce resistance. The French government fled Paris on September 2nd. German cavalry patrols reached the outskirts of the capital. It appeared that Germany would achieve its swift knockout victory against France, just as the plan promised. But the Schlieffen Plan contained fatal flaws. It required the German right wing to maintain its strength as it wheeled through Belgium and France, but the German High Command had actually weakened the right wing to strengthen forces elsewhere, including the Eastern Front. The modified plan called for the right wing to sweep east of Paris rather than west of it, a crucial change. As the German armies advanced, they spread out, creating gaps in the line. Supply lines stretched thin. Troops marching for weeks in summer heat reached the point of exhaustion. The French commander-in-chief, General Joseph Joffre, imperturbable despite the disasters, had been preparing a counterattack. On September 5, as German forces reached the Marne River, just 30 miles from Paris, French and British forces struck. The First Battle of the Marne would determine the course of the entire war in the West. The Battle of the Marne raged for 5 days across a 120-mile front. Paris taxicabs were famously requisitioned to rush French reserves to the front. The taxis of the Marne became legend, though their actual military impact was minimal. What mattered was that French and British forces exploited the gap between the German First and Second Armies, threatening to split the German advance and encircle its forces. On September 9th, the German High Command ordered a general retreat to the Aisne River. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. Germany would not win a swift victory in the West. Both sides now tried to outflank each other to the north in what became known as the Race to the Sea, a series of engagements that extended the front to the English Channel by mid-October. Where mobile warfare had failed, both sides began digging trenches. By November 1914, a continuous line of trenches stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea, a distance of over 400 miles. What everyone had expected to be a war of movement had become a war of position, a stalemate that would last for nearly 4 years and cost millions of lives. The age of trench warfare had begun. While the Western Front stabilized into stalemate, the war in the East unfolded on a vastly different scale. Here, vast distances, poor infrastructure, and smaller troop densities meant that mobile warfare continued throughout the conflict. The Eastern Front would stretch over 1,000 miles from the Baltic to the Carpathian Mountains, and the campaigns fought here would determine the fate of 3 empires. Russia surprised Germany and Austria-Hungary with the speed of its mobilization. Despite expectations that Russian armies would take weeks to assemble, 2 Russian armies invaded East Prussia in mid-August 1914, threatening the German industrial heartland. The crisis forced Germany to transfer 2 corps from the Western Front at a crucial moment in the Battle of the Marne, potentially contributing to the failure of the Schlieffen Plan. Germany recalled retired General Paul von Hindenburg and paired him with the brilliant strategist Erich Ludendorff to confront the Russian threat. The unlikely duo would become Germany's most celebrated military leaders. They inherited a plan from Colonel Max Hoffmann to defeat the 2 Russian armies separately before they could unite their forces. The Battle of Tannenberg, fought from August 26 to 30th, 1914, became one of the most decisive battles of the war. German forces encircled the Russian Second Army under General Alexander Samsonov, destroying it almost completely. Over 90,000 Russian soldiers were captured, thousands more killed, and Samsonov, facing disgrace, walked into a forest and shot himself. The Germans suffered fewer than 20,000 casualties. 2 weeks later, at the Battle of the Masurian Lakes, German forces drove the Russian First Army out of East Prussia, capturing another 100,000 prisoners. The twin victories made Hindenburg and Ludendorff national heroes in Germany and demonstrated both the bravery of Russian soldiers and the incompetence of much of their leadership. Russian officers communicated in clear radio transmissions that the Germans intercepted, fatally compromising their operations. Austria-Hungary, meanwhile, was struggling to execute its own war plans. Expecting an easy victory over Serbia, the empire instead launched 3 successive invasions of Serbia in 1914, all repulsed with heavy losses by the tough and motivated Serbian army. By December, Serbian forces had even occupied portions of Austro-Hungarian territory. The humiliation was complete. Austria-Hungary, which had started the war, had been defeated by the small nation it sought to crush. Against Russia, Austria-Hungary fared even worse. Russian armies invaded the province of Galicia, overwhelming Austro-Hungarian defenses. By September, Russian forces had captured the fortress city of Przemyśl and advanced deep into Austro-Hungarian territory. Only German intervention saved Vienna from facing Russian armies on its doorstep. Austria-Hungary's poor performance reflected deeper problems. Its army included soldiers speaking at least 11 different languages, many with little loyalty to the Habsburg dynasty. Slavic troops, particularly Czech and Serb units, sometimes surrendered en masse to the Russians. Equipment was often inadequate. Leadership was mediocre at best. From the war's beginning, Austria-Hungary required constant German support to avoid collapse. By the end of 1914, the Eastern Front had stabilized into a loose line of trenches and fortifications. Though nothing like the continuous line in the West, both sides had suffered enormous casualties. Russia alone had lost over 1 million men in 4 months. But unlike in the West, the fluidity of the Eastern Front meant that breakthrough and maneuver remained possible. The war here would continue to resemble 19th century warfare, far more than the industrial slaughter developing in France. Already, Russia's fundamental weaknesses were becoming apparent. While the Russian army could mobilize millions of men, it couldn't properly equip them. Shell shortages meant artillery fire had to be rationed. Rifles were in such short supply that some soldiers went to the front unarmed, told to retrieve weapons from fallen comrades. Transport infrastructure was wholly inadequate for modern war, and leadership, from the Tsar himself down through incompetent generals and corrupt bureaucrats, was unprepared for the demands of total war. By early 1915, the Western Front had evolved into an elaborate system of fortifications unlike anything previously seen in warfare. What had begun as hasty ditches scraped in the earth had become a vast underground world of trenches, bunkers, and tunnels. The front line actually consisted of 3 parallel trench systems: the fire trench facing the enemy, the support trench behind it, and the reserve trench farther back, connected by communication trenches running perpendicular to the front. Life in the trenches combined boredom with terror. Soldiers spent most of their time on routine tasks, repairing trenches, filling sandbags, standing sentry. The day began with morning stand to, when all troops man the fire step at dawn in case of enemy attack. After dawn passed without incident, soldiers could eat breakfast, often consisting of tea, bread, and whatever else could be brought up the night before. But the trenches were places of indescribable misery. Water collected in the bottom, creating thick mud that could swallow a man. Soldiers stood in water for days, developing trench foot, a painful condition that could lead to gangrene and amputation. Rats, grown huge on the corpses in no man's land, infested the trenches by the millions, spreading disease and terrorizing sleeping soldiers. Lice were universal, even generals had them, causing constant itching and spreading trench fever. Between the opposing trenches lay no man's land, a nightmare landscape of shell craters, barbed wire, and decomposing bodies. Barbed wire, sometimes in belts 50 yards deep, protected each trench system. Any attack required crossing this deadly space under machine gun and artillery fire. German machine gunners particularly became expert at creating interlocking fields of fire that made any advance suicidal. The machine gun defined trench warfare more than any other weapon. The German MG-08, based on Hiram Maxim's design, could fire 450 rounds per minute with devastating accuracy. A single well-positioned machine gun could stop an entire battalion. British and French commanders initially underestimated the machine gun, but by 1915, they understood its terrible power. The question was how to overcome it. Artillery became the true killer of the Great War, responsible for perhaps 60% of all casualties. Guns ranged from light field pieces to massive siege howitzers firing shells weighing over a ton. A major offensive would be preceded by bombardments lasting days or even weeks, intended to destroy enemy trenches, cut barbed wire, and break the defenders' morale. The bombardments created a hellish landscape where nothing could survive, except that men in deep dugouts often did survive, emerging when the barrage lifted to man their machine guns. The standard tactic became grimly predictable. After days of bombardment, officers would blow whistles and men would climb ladders to go over the top, advancing in waves across no man's land. Survivors of the bombardment would emerge from their dugouts, set up machine guns, and cut down the attackers. Those who reached the enemy trenches often faced fierce hand-to-hand combat with bombs, bayonets, and clubs. Even successful attacks usually gained only a few hundred yards before being thrown back by counterattacks. The psychological toll was immense. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, afflicted hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Men who had endured bombardments that literally shook the earth, who had seen friends torn apart by shells, who had lived for months in constant fear of death, sometimes simply broke down. Some shook uncontrollably. Others went mute. Some wandered into no man's land as if in a trance. Initially dismissed as cowardice, shell shock was gradually recognized as a genuine psychological injury. Yet amid the horror, moments of humanity persisted. The Christmas truce of 1914, when British and German soldiers spontaneously stopped fighting, left their trenches, exchanged gifts, and even played football in no man's land, became legendary. It happened along much of the Western Front, though high command on both sides was horrified and worked to ensure it never happened again. By 1915, the war had hardened men's hearts. The brief flowering of peace in the midst of war would not be repeated. Soldiers found ways to cope with the nightmare. Letters home provided a vital connection to the world they had left behind. Humor, often dark and bitter, helped men maintain sanity. Superstitions proliferated, lucky charms, rituals to ward off death. Strong bonds formed between soldiers who shared the danger and misery. These friendships, forged in the trenches, were often the most intense relationships of their lives. Neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough. Attacks that cost tens of thousands of casualties might gain a mile or two of shattered ground, only to lose it in the next enemy offensive. The Western Front barely moved for 3 years. Generals, trained in mobile warfare, struggled to adapt to this new reality. Soldiers paid the price for their learning curve, dying by the hundreds of thousands in offensives that achieved nothing. The year 1915 brought new players into the conflict and saw the war expand to new theaters across the globe. On November 2nd, 1914, the Ottoman Empire had entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, opening new fronts in the Middle East and threatening British imperial communications through the Suez Canal. The Ottoman entry transformed the war's strategic landscape. Britain now faced threats to Egypt, the Suez Canal, and potentially even India. Russia, which had been receiving supplies through the Dardanelles Straits, found itself cut off from its Western allies except through the dangerous Arctic route to Arkhangelsk. The Ottomans controlled the holy sites of Islam, and their sultan claimed the title of Caliph, spiritual leader of the world's Muslims, raising fears of jihad against the British, French, and Russian empires with their millions of Muslim subjects. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, proposed a bold plan to break the stalemate. A naval force would force the Dardanelles Straits, steam to Constantinople, and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. This would reopen supply lines to Russia, potentially bring neutral Balkan states into the war on the Allied side, and threaten Austria-Hungary from the south. It was, on paper, a brilliant strategic conception that could change the entire character of the war. The naval attack began on February 19, 1915. British and French warships bombarded the Ottoman forts guarding the straits. Initial progress was encouraging, but on March 18th, a major push to force the straits ended in disaster when 3 battleships struck mines and sank. The naval commanders, shaken by the losses, decided that land forces would be needed to secure the straits before the fleet could pass through. The ensuing Gallipoli campaign became one of the war's most controversial operations. On April 25, 1915, British, French, and Anzac forces, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula under heavy fire. The Anzacs landed at the wrong beach, coming ashore beneath steep cliffs where Ottoman forces quickly pinned them down. British troops at Cape Helles faced similar difficulties. What was supposed to be a quick breakthrough became another grinding stalemate. At Gallipoli, soldiers faced all the miseries of Western Front trench warfare, plus additional horrors. Summer temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Water was desperately short. Flies swarmed in biblical proportions, spreading dysentery that weakened the army more than enemy fire. The terrain favored defense. Ottoman forces, under the command of Mustafa Kemal, held the heights and could observe every Allied movement. The Ottoman defense, contrary to racist Allied expectations, proved tenacious and skillful. Mustafa Kemal, commanding the 19th Division, rushed his troops to stop the Anzac landing at the critical moment, then led counterattacks that came within yards of throwing the Allies back into the sea. German advisors, particularly General Lehmann von Sanders, helped coordinate the defense, but it was Ottoman soldiers and officers who did the fighting and dying. Throughout the summer of 1915, the Allies launched a series of offensives, trying to break out of their beachheads. Each failed, with heavy casualties. A new landing at Suvla Bay in August, intended to outflank Ottoman positions, was bungled by incompetent commanders and quickly contained. By autumn, it was clear the campaign had failed. Allied forces evacuated in December 1915 and January 1916. Ironically, the evacuation was the best planned and most successful part of the entire operation, accomplished without a single casualty. The Gallipoli campaign cost the Allies about 250,000 casualties, including 8,700 Australians and 2,700 New Zealanders. Devastating losses for the small populations of these nations. Ottoman casualties were similar, about 250,000. The campaign achieved nothing strategically, but had profound political consequences. In Britain, it contributed to the downfall of the Liberal government. In Australia and New Zealand, it became a foundational national myth. For the Ottoman Empire, it was a rare victory that prolonged the war and delayed the empire's collapse. May 1915 brought another new belligerent into the war. Italy, despite being nominally allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary, had remained neutral in 1914. Now, lured by Allied promises of Austrian territory, Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary. The Italian front that opened in the Alps and along the Isonzo River would become another grinding stalemate. Remarkable mainly for its appalling conditions. Soldiers fought battles at 10,000 feet elevation, where cold and avalanches killed as many as enemy fire. April 22nd, 1915, brought a new horror to warfare when Germany released chlorine gas against French positions near Ypres. A greenish-yellow cloud drifted toward the Allied trenches, suffocating everyone in its path. Soldiers who had never seen gas panicked and fled, opening a 4-mile gap in the Allied lines. Only the Germans' own surprise at the weapon's effectiveness and lack of reserves prevented a breakthrough. Chemical warfare escalated rapidly. Both sides developed deadlier agents, phosgene, mustard gas, and others. Gas masks became standard equipment, though they were uncomfortable and imperfect protection. Gas attacks were particularly terrifying because the weapon was invisible until too late, and death came through suffocation or with mustard gas, through chemical burns that could take weeks to kill. By war's end, chemical weapons had caused over 1 million casualties, though relatively few deaths compared to conventional weapons. On the Eastern Front, 1915 brought a massive German-Austrian offensive that drove deep into Russian territory. The Gorlice-Tarnov offensive, beginning in May, combined overwhelming artillery firepower with tactical innovation to shatter Russian defenses. By September, the Central Powers had conquered Poland, Lithuania, and parts of Latvia, taking over 1 million Russian prisoners and inflicting 2 million total casualties. The Great Retreat of 1915 devastated the Russian army and demoralized Russian society. Millions of refugees fled eastward, clogging roads and spreading chaos. The Russian economy, already strained, began to collapse under the war's demands. Shortages of food, fuel, and manufactured goods created widespread suffering. Tsar Nicholas II, unwisely, took personal command of the army in September 1915, making himself directly responsible for future military failures. The seeds of revolution were being planted. By the end of 1915, the war had become truly global. Campaigns raged in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Japan had seized German possessions in China and the Pacific. German colonies in Africa were under attack by British, French, and South African forces. The war's economic impact affected neutral nations across the world, and everywhere, casualty lists grew longer. The war that everyone thought would be over in months showed no sign of ending. If anything, it was intensifying. The year 1916 would witness two of history's bloodiest and most futile battles, Verdun and the Somme, grinding exercises in attrition that would come to symbolize the senseless slaughter of the Great War. Together, these battles would cause over 2 million casualties and barely move the front line. Germany's chief of staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, developed a strategy for 1916 that openly acknowledged the war had become one of attrition. Unable to achieve breakthrough, he would instead attack a point the French would feel compelled to defend at any cost, then use Germany's superior artillery to bleed France white. He chose Verdun, a fortress city that held deep symbolic significance for France, guarding the approaches to Paris. On February 21, 1916, at 7:15 a.m., The Germans opened the heaviest artillery bombardment yet seen in warfare. Over 1,200 guns fired on an 8-mile front, dropping 2 million shells in the first 12 hours. The bombardment pulverized French trenches, buried soldiers alive, and created a moonscape of overlapping craters. Then, German infantry advanced, using new tactics, small groups infiltrating French positions rather than dense waves. Initial German success was dramatic. Fort Douaumont, the strongest point in Verdun's defenses, fell to a small German force on February 25th with almost no fighting. The French had left it virtually ungarrisoned. The loss shocked France, but French commander Philippe Pétain organized a determined defense, declaring, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. Verdun would not fall. Pétain organized supply up a single road, the Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way, where trucks passed every 14 seconds, 24 hours a day, bringing men and supplies to the front and evacuating casualties. He also rotated units through Verdun rapidly, ensuring that most of the French army would experience what soldiers simply called the Hell of Verdun. This had the effect of spreading the trauma throughout the entire French army. The battle evolved into a nightmare of artillery bombardment and infantry assaults over ground so devastated that it resembled a lunar landscape. Villages were obliterated so completely that their sites remained empty after the war. The Bois de Cour, Morthomme, Côte 304. These places became synonyms for hell on earth. Men lived, fought, and died in shell holes filled with water and the decomposing bodies of earlier casualties. As spring turned to summer, the French counterattacked, trying to recover lost ground. The battle spread wider as both sides fed in more troops and artillery. The Germans, who had initiated the battle to bleed France, found themselves equally bled. Falkenhayn's strategy had backfired. Germany was suffering casualties nearly as severe as France's, and far from bleeding France to death, he had given France a symbol of national resistance. To relieve pressure on Verdun, the British agreed to launch a major offensive on the Somme River. Originally planned as a joint Anglo-French operation, French exhaustion at Verdun meant the Somme would be primarily a British effort. General Douglas Haig, commanding British forces, planned an offensive that would break through German lines and restore mobile warfare. His confidence was boundless. The reality would be catastrophic. The preliminary bombardment began on June 24, 1916, and continued for 7 days. Over 1.5 million shells were fired at German positions. British commanders believed nothing could survive such bombardment. They were wrong. Many shells failed to explode. British industry rapidly expanded, and employing many women and unskilled workers, produced munitions of variable quality. The bombardment often failed to cut the dense German barbed wire, and German troops sheltered in deep dugouts, some 40 feet underground, waiting out the storm. July 1st, 1916, became the bloodiest day in British military history. At 7:30 a.m., whistles blew along a 15-mile front, and British soldiers climbed out of their trenches. Many units were ordered to advance in waves, walking in lines across no man's land, laden with 60 pounds of equipment. Their officers had been told German defenses would be destroyed. They weren't. German machine gunners emerged from their dugouts, set up their weapons, and mowed down the British troops advancing across open ground. In some sectors, entire battalions were wiped out in minutes, cut down before they even reached German barbed wire. By day's end, the British had suffered 57,470 casualties, including 19,240 dead. For this staggering loss, they had gained a few thousand yards on a narrow front. But Haig continued the offensive through the summer and into autumn. Each attack followed the same pattern: bombardment, assault, limited gain, German counterattack. New weapons appeared. Tanks made their debut in September, though technical problems and poor tactics limited their impact. The Germans introduced new defensive tactics, creating flexible defense in depth, rather than trying to hold every yard of front-line trench. When the Battle of the Somme finally ended in November, after 4.5 months, the British and French had advanced about 6 miles at the deepest point. The British had suffered 420,000 casualties. The French, despite their limited role, lost 200,000. German casualties were about 500,000. Over 1 million men had become casualties to gain a few miles of devastated ground, and the German line remained unbroken. At Verdun, the French finally went over to the offensive in October, recapturing Fort Douaumont in a few days of fighting. By December, they had recovered nearly all the ground lost since February. The battle had lasted 10 months and cost roughly 300,000 dead, French and German combined, and over 700,000 total casualties, and the front line was almost exactly where it had been when the battle began. The battles of 1916 destroyed the illusions that remained about war's glory or nobility. French troops at Verdun, rotated through what they called the mincing machine, were traumatized on a mass scale. The British Army, Kitchener's volunteer army of enthusiastic patriots, was shattered on the Somme. The German army, though it had held its positions, was bled nearly white, and military commanders seemed to have learned nothing. They would repeat the same tactics on an even larger scale in 1917. While Verdun and the Somme consumed attention, the war continued on other fronts. Russia launched the Brusilov offensive against Austria-Hungary in June, initially achieving spectacular success and nearly knocking Austria-Hungary out of the war. But lack of coordination with other Russian forces and German reinforcements eventually stopped the offensive. Romania entered the war on the Allied side in August, only to be rapidly crushed by German, Austrian, and Bulgarian forces. At sea, the Battle of Jutland in May 1916 saw the only major clash between the British and German battle fleets, ending inconclusively but confirming British naval dominance. By the end of 1916, all the belligerent nations were showing signs of strain. Food shortages affected civilians in every country. War industries consumed resources at unsustainable rates. Casualty lists seemed endless. In every nation, questions were being asked. How long could this continue? What were they fighting for? Was any objective worth this price? But the governments and generals, having invested so much blood and treasure, could not imagine stopping now. The war would continue into its third year, then its fourth, consuming everything and everyone in its path. While armies clashed on land, a different kind of war was being fought at sea. A war of blockade and submarine, of distant patrols and rare fleet actions, a war whose outcome would prove crucial to the conflict's final result. Before the war, Britain and Germany had engaged in a massive naval arms race, competing to build the most powerful fleet of dreadnought battleships. These enormous vessels, mounting 10 or more heavy guns and capable of 20 knots or more, made all previous warships obsolete. Britain, whose empire depended on naval supremacy, was determined to maintain a decisive advantage. Germany, seeking great power status, built a fleet to challenge British dominance. When war came, the Royal Navy immediately established a distant blockade of Germany, using its geographical position to control access to the North Sea. No blockade runners could reach German ports without passing through waters patrolled by British warships. The blockade strangled Germany's overseas trade, cutting off imports of food, raw materials, and war supplies. It was economic warfare on a grand scale, and it slowly began to strangle the German war effort. Germany responded with submarine warfare. The U-boat, Unterseeboot, could slip past surface patrols to attack merchant shipping bound for Britain. Initially, German submarines followed prize rules, surfacing to warn merchant ships before sinking them. But Britain armed its merchantmen and used Q-ships, warships disguised as merchant vessels, to ambush surfacing submarines. Germany gradually moved toward unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking ships without warning. The sinking of the Lusitania on May 7, 1915, shocked the world. A German U-boat torpedoed the British liner off Ireland, sending her to the bottom in 18 minutes and killing 1,198 people, including 128 Americans. Germany argued that the Lusitania carried munitions, which was true, but the death toll, particularly of civilians and neutral citizens, created a propaganda disaster. American protests forced Germany to temporarily restrict submarine operations. The war's only major fleet action occurred on May 31, 1916, when the German High Seas Fleet encountered the British Grand Fleet off Denmark's Jutland coast. In a confused battle fought in poor visibility, both sides lost ships and thousands of men. British losses were heavier: 3 battlecruisers, 3 cruisers, and 8 destroyers sunk, with 6,000 dead. German losses were smaller: 1 battleship, 1 battlecruiser, 4 light cruisers, and 5 destroyers, with 2,500 dead. Germany claimed tactical victory at Jutland, having sunk more ships than it lost. But Britain won the strategic victory. The German High Seas Fleet retreated to port and never again seriously challenged British naval dominance. The blockade continued. Germany's surface fleet became irrelevant, spending the rest of the war in port, where growing hunger and war weariness would eventually spawn mutiny. Britain remained master of the seas. By early 1917, Germany faced a desperate situation. The Allied blockade was causing severe food shortages. The army was exhausted after Verdun and the Somme. Germany's military leaders concluded that unrestricted submarine warfare offered the only hope of victory. They calculated that if U-boats sank 600,000 tons of shipping monthly, Britain would be starved into surrender within 6 months. They also calculated that this would bring America into the war, but believed Britain would collapse before American power could make itself felt. The naval war directly affected civilian populations through blockade and food shortages. But the entire war had transformed life on the home front in every belligerent nation. This was total war. Not just armies, but entire societies mobilized for conflict. Governments took unprecedented control over economies, directing production, controlling prices, rationing food and fuel. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs in munitions factories, transport, agriculture, work previously considered exclusively male. Munitionettes in Britain, munitionettes in France. Women workers produced the shells, bullets, and bombs that fed the insatiable appetite of the front. The work was dangerous. Explosions killed hundreds, and exposure to toxic chemicals turned many women's skin yellow, earning them the nickname Canary Girls. Propaganda became a central weapon. Every government established agencies to shape public opinion, producing posters, films, and pamphlets that demonized the enemy, glorified sacrifice, and encouraged support for the war effort. Germans were portrayed as barbaric Huns, gleefully bayoneting Belgian babies. The Kaiser was caricatured with blood dripping from his fangs. Allied propaganda was equally lurid, depicting German war aims as world domination and German methods as uniquely brutal. Food shortages affected all belligerent nations by 1917, though severity varied. Germany suffered most severely under the British blockade. The winter of 1916–17, remembered as the turnip winter, saw Germans reduced to eating turnips and acorns as substitutes for unavailable foods. Malnutrition weakened civilian health, particularly affecting children and the elderly. Even in Britain, with its command of the seas, food had to be rationed from 1918 onward. War weariness and opposition grew as the conflict dragged on. Strikes erupted in munitions factories in France, Britain, and Germany. Socialist parties, which had initially supported their nation's war efforts, began to split between pro-war and anti-war factions. Pacifist movements gained strength, though governments suppressed them harshly. In Russia, the strains would prove fatal to the old order. Governments cracked down on dissent with censorship and repression. Newspapers were censored, mail was opened, and critics of the war faced imprisonment. In Britain, conscientious objectors were imprisoned or forced into non-combat service. France executed soldiers for mutiny. Germany's military dictatorship under Hindenburg and Ludendorff by 1917 tolerated no opposition. Civil liberties, already limited, nearly disappeared in the name of national security. By early 1917, every nation showed signs of severe strain. Casualty lists seemed endless. Food was scarce. Inflation eroded workers' wages. No end to the war was in sight. The question was which nation would break first, or whether all might collapse simultaneously into revolution and chaos. The year 1917 would provide dramatic answers. The year 1917 would transform the war entirely, bringing revolution, new belligerents, and the beginning of the end. It began with Russia in crisis. 3 years of war had devastated the Russian economy. Millions of casualties had demoralized the army. Food shortages in cities sparked increasing unrest. Tsar Nicholas II, personally commanding the army since 1915, was blamed for every military failure. His wife, Empress Alexandra, and her advisor, the mystic Rasputin, were widely suspected of treason. Russia was a powder keg waiting to explode. In March 1917, February by the old Russian calendar, the explosion came. Strikes and demonstrations in Petrograd over bread shortages escalated into general insurrection. Soldiers ordered to fire on protesters instead joined them. The Tsar's government collapsed in days. Nicholas II, abandoned by his generals and ministers, abdicated on March 15th. A provisional government, dominated by liberals and moderate socialists, took power, promising to continue the war while implementing reforms. But the provisional government faced immediate rivals. Soviets, councils of workers and soldiers, sprang up in every city, claiming to represent the people's will. In this chaotic situation, the German government made a calculated decision. They arranged for Vladimir Lenin, leader of the radical Bolshevik Party, to return to Russia from exile in Switzerland. The Germans hoped Lenin would pull Russia out of the war. They were right, though the consequences would exceed their expectations. The provisional government, committed to its Western allies, launched one last offensive in July, the Kerensky Offensive, named for the government's leading figure, Alexander Kerensky. Initially successful, the offensive quickly collapsed as demoralized Russian units refused to fight. German counterattacks drove deep into Russian lines. Desertions reached epidemic proportions as soldiers simply walked away from the front, heading home to seize land from aristocratic estates. With their simple slogan, "Peace, land, bread," gained support. On November 7th, October 25th by the old calendar, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd in a nearly bloodless coup. Lenin immediately issued a decree on peace, calling for an end to the war without annexations or indemnities. Germany, desperate to transfer troops from east to west for a final offensive, demanded harsh peace terms. After months of negotiation, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. The treaty was devastating. Russia lost Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, Finland, and other territories containing 1/3 of its population, 1/3 of its agricultural land, and 3/4 of its iron and coal. Germany had achieved in the East what it had failed to achieve in the West. Total victory. But the victory would prove short-lived. While Russia left the war, America entered it. The United States had remained neutral since 1914, though its sympathies and economic ties increasingly favored the Allies. President Woodrow Wilson had won re-election in 1916, partly on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917 pushed America toward intervention. The Zimmermann telegram provided the final push. In January 1917, German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann sent a coded telegram to Mexico proposing a German-Mexican alliance against the United States. If America entered the war, Germany would help Mexico recover Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. British intelligence intercepted and decrypted the telegram, then gave it to American newspapers. The revelation outraged American public opinion. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany, framing it as a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. Congress approved on April 6th. America entered the war with a tiny army of 200,000 men, smaller than Belgium's in 1914, but with enormous industrial capacity and a population of 100 million. The question was whether American power could reach Europe before Germany won the war. America mobilized with impressive speed. Conscription through the Selective Service Act brought millions into uniform. Training camps appeared across the country. The economy shifted to war production. Women joined the workforce. Liberty loan drives raised billions of dollars. Popular culture became saturated with war propaganda. Songs, posters, movies, all urging support for our boys over there. The American Expeditionary Force, commanded by General John J. Pershing, began arriving in France in summer 1917. Pershing insisted on maintaining an independent American army rather than feeding American units into French and British commands as replacements. This created tension with Allied commanders desperate for manpower, but ensured America would have an independent voice in peace negotiations. The first American units entered trenches in October 1917, though significant American forces wouldn't be available until 1918. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, 1917 brought yet another series of futile offensives. The British launched the Third Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele, in July, hoping to break through in Flanders and threaten German submarine bases on the Belgian coast. The offensive achieved local successes, but at a terrible cost. Unprecedented rain turned the battlefield into a swamp. Men drowned in shell holes filled with liquid mud. After 4 months of fighting and 325,000 British casualties, the offensive ended with a gain of 5 miles. The French army nearly collapsed in 1917. After yet another failed offensive, the Nivelle offensive in April, French soldiers had had enough. Mutinies swept through the army in May and June. Troops refused to attack, though they were willing to defend. Entire divisions elected councils and sang the Internationale. The crisis was so severe that for weeks, the French army could not have defended against a German offensive. Fortunately for the Allies, German intelligence failed to detect the crisis. General Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun, took command and restored order through a combination of understanding and discipline. He improved conditions for soldiers, better food, more leave, 55 mutineers were executed to restore discipline, but Pétain treated the mutiny primarily as a failure of leadership rather than treason. The French army survived, but it would not launch major offensives for the rest of the year. The year 1917 ended with the Allies in a precarious position. Russia was effectively out of the war. The French army was recovering from near collapse. The Italian army had suffered a catastrophic defeat at Caporetto in October, nearly being knocked out of the war. Only the British were still capable of offensive operations, and they were exhausted after Passchendaele. American forces were arriving, but slowly. Germany would have one last chance for victory in 1918, before American power became decisive. As 1918 began, Germany faced a strategic reality that forced desperate action. Victory over Russia had freed nearly 50 divisions to transfer west. But time was running out. American troops were arriving in France at a rate of 250,000 per month. By summer, the Allies would have overwhelming numerical superiority. Germany had one narrow window to win the war: spring 1918. General Erich Ludendorff, effectively Germany's military dictator by this point, planned to stake everything on one massive offensive. German tactical innovation gave Ludendorff reason for optimism. New infiltration tactics developed on the Eastern Front emphasized small groups of elite stormtroopers bypassing strong points to penetrate deep into enemy positions. Artillery techniques had been refined, predicted fire using mathematical calculations rather than ranging shots, allowing surprise bombardments. Gas shells would silence enemy batteries, while high-explosive shells pulverized defenses. After 3 years of stalemate, the German army believed it had finally solved the problem of trench warfare. On March 21, 1918, at 4:40 a.m., over 6,000 German guns opened fire on the British Fifth Army along a 50-mile front near the Somme. For 5 hours, the most intense bombardment of the war rained shells on British positions. Then, concealed by fog, German stormtroopers attacked. The British line, weakened by transfers to other sectors and extended to take over French positions, crumbled. Within hours, Germans had penetrated several miles, a breakthrough on a scale not seen since 1914. For the first time in years, open warfare returned to the Western Front. German spearheads advanced 40 miles in some areas, overrunning British positions and capturing thousands of prisoners and hundreds of guns. Paris came under fire from the Paris gun, a super long-range artillery piece that could fire shells 75 miles. The Allied situation looked desperate. French and British forces, separated by the German advance, seemed on the verge of complete defeat. The crisis finally forced the Allies to adopt unified command. On April 3rd, French General Ferdinand Foch was appointed Supreme Allied Commander, giving him authority to coordinate British, French, and American forces. Foch's first priority was to prevent the Germans from splitting the Allied armies and driving to the Channel ports. He scraped together reserves and rushed them to threatened sectors, always maintaining a unified front. But the German offensive was running out of steam. The stormtroopers who had led the advance were exhausted and had taken heavy casualties. Supply lines couldn't keep up with the rapid advance. German soldiers, half-starved after years of blockade, stopped to loot British supply dumps rather than pressing the attack. And the tactical breakthrough hadn't led to strategic victory. German forces had created a large bulge in the Allied lines, but hadn't destroyed any Allied armies or captured any decisive objectives. Ludendorff launched 4 more major offensives between April and July, each following the same pattern: initial success, deep penetration, then gradual stalling as Allied reinforcements arrived and German troops exhausted themselves. An attack in Flanders in April gained ground but failed to reach the Channel ports. An attack on the Chemin des Dames in May surprised and routed French forces, bringing Germans within 40 miles of Paris, but again failed to achieve decisive results. American forces, now arriving in strength, fought their first major battles in May and June. At Chateau Thierry, American troops helped stop the German advance on Paris. At Belleau Wood, Marines fought a savage month-long battle to clear Germans from a small forest. American casualties were heavy. Their tactics were sometimes suicidal, but their arrival gave the Allies hope and Germany cause for despair. Fresh American divisions, each larger than a British or French division, were entering the line faster than Germany could replace its losses. Ludendorff's final offensive came on July 15, 1918, the Second Battle of the Marne. But this time, French intelligence had discovered German attack plans. French artillery caught German troops massing in the open, inflicting heavy casualties before the attack even began. The offensive gained little ground and was stopped within days. The German army had shot its bolt. It had no more reserves, no more offensive capability. Now it would be the Allies' turn. On August 8, 1918, British, Canadian, Australian, and French forces, supported by 450 tanks, attacked near Amiens. The assault shattered German defenses, advancing 8 miles on the first day, the greatest one-day advance since trench warfare began. Over 30,000 German soldiers surrendered. Ludendorff called August 8 the Black Day of the German army, recognizing that morale had collapsed. Soldiers who had endured 4 years of war saw no point in further sacrifice. What became known as the 100 Days Offensive had begun. Through August, September, and October, Allied forces attacked all along the Western Front in a series of coordinated offensives. Unlike earlier attacks that focused on single breakthrough points, this campaign kept constant pressure across the entire front, preventing Germans from concentrating reserves. New tactics emphasized combined arms, infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft working together. The Allies had finally learned how to break trench warfare. The German army, though retreating, fought skillfully. Rear guards delayed Allied advances with machine guns and artillery. Ludendorff established new defensive lines, each of which had to be assaulted at considerable cost. But the trend was unmistakable. Germany was being pushed back, losing ground gained in 4 years of war. And behind the military situation, Germany's strategic position was collapsing entirely. In September, Allied forces in the Balkans finally broke through Bulgarian defenses. Bulgaria, exhausted and invaded, signed an armistice on September 29, opening the road to Austria-Hungary. In the Middle East, British forces under General Edmund Allenby routed Ottoman armies in Palestine and Syria, capturing Damascus in October. In Italy, Austrian forces were falling back after a failed offensive. Germany's allies were collapsing. Inside Germany, the situation was dire. 4 years of British blockade had caused severe malnutrition. Industrial production was falling. War weariness had turned to desperation. As news of military defeats spread, revolutionary sentiment grew. Strikes erupted in munitions factories. Sailors mutinied rather than sail on a suicidal final battle with the British fleet. The German government recognized that the war was lost and began seeking an armistice. Ludendorff, who had insisted on continuing the war until August, suddenly demanded immediate armistice in late September, shocking civilian leaders. Germany approached President Wilson seeking peace based on his 14 points, a moderate program that promised self-determination and a peace without victory. But Wilson insisted on dealing with a democratic government, not the military dictatorship. Germany quickly liberalized, establishing parliamentary government and forcing the Kaiser to abdicate. Armistice negotiations began in November in a railroad car in the forest of Compiègne. The Allied terms were harsh: immediate evacuation of occupied territories, surrender of vast quantities of weapons, and Allied occupation of German territory as guarantee. Germany, with revolution spreading and its army disintegrating, had no choice but to accept. At 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The Great War ended as it had begun, with a mixture of relief and incomprehension. Soldiers in the trenches, told the war was over, sometimes didn't know how to react. 4 years of slaughter had ended, but what had been achieved? As the guns fell silent, humanity began to count the cost of the most destructive conflict in history. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Approximately 10 million soldiers died in the war. Germany lost 2 million men. Russia lost 1.8 million. France lost 1.4 million, nearly 1 in 6 adult males. The British Empire lost nearly 1 million. Austria-Hungary lost over 1 million. The United States, in the war for only 18 months, lost 116,000. These figures represent only the dead. The wounded numbered over 20 million more. The wounded bore scars for life. Modern weapons created injuries of horrific severity. Hundreds of thousands of men lost limbs, many losing multiple limbs. Facial injuries were common and devastating. Primitive plastic surgery could do little to repair faces destroyed by high explosive shells. The broken faces, les gueules cassées, in France, were hidden away, too terrible for society to look upon. Blindness and deafness afflicted tens of thousands, and countless others carried invisible wounds. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, that would haunt them for decades. Civilian deaths may have numbered even higher than military deaths. The British blockade of Germany caused perhaps 750,000 deaths from starvation and malnutrition. The Russian Civil War that followed the Bolshevik Revolution killed millions through combat, terror, famine, and disease. Genocidal violence in the Ottoman Empire, the Armenian Genocide, campaigns against Greeks and Assyrians, killed at least 1.5 million. Spanish influenza, spread by the war and military movements, killed 50 to 100 million globally. The war's physical destruction was concentrated in relatively narrow belts along the fighting fronts, but the devastation there was total. Northern France and Belgium became moonscapes of shell craters. Towns and villages were obliterated. Forests were reduced to fields of splintered stumps. Agricultural land was poisoned by chemicals and littered with unexploded ordnance. Some areas remain dangerous today. In Eastern Europe, years of campaigning and subsequent civil wars created similar devastation across vast territories. The financial cost was staggering. Total war expenditure exceeded $200 billion, over $4 trillion in today's money. Britain's national debt increased tenfold. France and Germany were bankrupted. The war destroyed Europe's financial dominance, transferring economic power to the United States. International trade patterns were disrupted. Empires that had seemed permanent began to crumble. The global economic order that had existed before 1914 was shattered beyond repair. In January 1919, representatives of the victorious powers gathered in Paris to write the peace treaties. The Paris Peace Conference brought together hundreds of delegates from around the world. But the crucial decisions were made by the Big Four: American President Woodrow Wilson, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, French Premier Georges Clemenceau, and Italian Premier Vittorio Orlando. These four men, with their conflicting visions and national interests, would reshape the world. Wilson arrived in Paris with an idealistic vision. His 14 points called for open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, free trade, disarmament, and self-determination for all peoples. Most importantly, Wilson proposed a League of Nations that would mediate international disputes and prevent future wars. European crowds greeted Wilson as a messiah, but his idealism would crash against the hard realities of European politics and his own political mistakes. Clemenceau, the French tiger, wanted security above all. France had been invaded twice by Germany in living memory. Clemenceau demanded that Germany be permanently weakened, its territory reduced, its military crippled, and reparations to pay for French reconstruction. He wanted the Rhineland occupied or even separated from Germany. French security, not Wilsonian idealism, was his priority, and France had the devastation to back its demands. The war had been fought largely on French soil. Lloyd George occupied a middle position. Britain wanted Germany weakened, but not destroyed. A strong Germany could serve as a counterweight to France. Britain also wanted to maintain its empire and naval supremacy, goals that sometimes conflicted with Wilson's self-determination and freedom of the seas. Lloyd George faced domestic pressure. He had won election in 1918 on promises to hang the Kaiser and make Germany pay. But he privately worried that a harsh peace would create future conflicts. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the Sarajevo assassination, imposed harsh terms on Germany. Germany lost all colonies, 13% of its European territory, 10% of its population, and much of its coal and iron resources. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. The Rhineland would be occupied by Allied forces for 15 years. German military was limited to 100,000 men with no tanks, aircraft, or submarines. Most controversially, Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, declared Germany responsible for the war and liable for all damages. The reparations figure, finally set at $33 billion in 1921, was intended to make Germany pay for Allied war costs and reconstruction. The sum was far beyond Germany's capacity to pay without impoverishing itself. Reparations became a source of lasting bitterness in Germany and a political football in international relations. The economic instability they caused would contribute to the Great Depression and the rise of extremism. The peace settlement redrew the map of Europe and the Middle East. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires all disappeared, replaced by new nation-states supposedly based on national self-determination. Poland was reborn after 123 years of partition. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were created from Austro-Hungarian territory. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, gained independence from Russia. Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory. Austria was reduced to a small German-speaking rump state. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire was dismembered. Britain and France divided most of its Arab territories between them under League of Nations mandates, supposedly temporary arrangements to prepare peoples for self-government, but actually thinly veiled colonialism. Britain took Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. France took Syria and Lebanon. These arbitrary borders, drawn with little regard for ethnic or religious realities, created problems that persist today. The principle of self-determination was applied selectively and imperfectly. New borders often ignored ethnic realities. Millions of Germans found themselves in Czechoslovakia and Poland. Hungarians lived in Romania and Yugoslavia. The right to self-determination was denied to colonized peoples in Asia and Africa. Arabs felt betrayed by British and French mandates. Zionists and Palestinian Arabs were set on a collision course in Palestine. The peace settlement created as many problems as it solved. The League of Nations, Wilson's great achievement, was established to prevent future wars through collective security. Nations would pledge to submit disputes to mediation and to act together against aggressors. It was a noble vision and a failure almost from birth. The United States Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, keeping America out of the League. Without American participation, the League lacked the power to enforce its decisions. It would prove unable to prevent the next war. In Germany, the Treaty of Versailles was universally condemned as a dictated peace, a diktat. Germans had expected a peace based on Wilson's 14 points. Instead, they received what they saw as a vindictive punishment, the War Guilt Clause. particularly enraged Germans, who believed all nations bore responsibility for the war. The myth of stab in the back, that Germany's army had been betrayed by socialists and Jews at home, gained traction, obscuring the reality of military defeat. Resentment over Versailles would poison German politics for decades. The Great War left wounds too deep to heal quickly. In every town and village across Europe, war memorials were erected, listing the names of the fallen. The memorials became focal points for grief and remembrance. On November 11th, each year, at the 11th hour, nations stopped to remember the armistice and honor the dead. The red poppy, which bloomed on the battlefields of Flanders, became a symbol of remembrance. The war decimated an entire generation. The young men who should have become the leaders, artists, and fathers of the 1920s and 1930s were dead. Britain lost poets like Wilfred Owen and Rupert Brooke. France lost nearly an entire class from the École Normale Supérieure. Talented individuals from every field and nation died in the mud of Flanders or the forests of the Eastern Front. Their potential, their contributions to human civilization were erased. This was perhaps the war's most incalculable loss. Those who survived often struggled to return to normal life. How could men who had endured the trenches return to the mundane concerns of peacetime? Veterans spoke of a gulf between themselves and those who hadn't served, a sense that civilians could never understand what they had experienced. Many veterans struggled with physical and psychological wounds for the rest of their lives. Some became advocates for peace, determined that such slaughter never be repeated. Others embraced militarism and violence, laying groundwork for fascist movements. The war produced a remarkable body of literature as soldiers tried to make sense of their experiences. Poets like Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Robert Graves gave voice to the horror and futility of trench warfare. Novels like Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front and Henri Barbouze's Under Fire portrayed war's brutality with unprecedented realism. These works helped shape how later generations would remember the war as pointless slaughter, lions led by donkeys, youth sacrificed by incompetent old men. The war's political consequences rippled through the 20th century. The Russian Revolution, born from wartime collapse, established the world's first communist state. The Soviet Union would challenge Western capitalism for 70 years. Fascism emerged in Italy and would spread to Germany and elsewhere, feeding on war grievances and economic instability. Democracy seemed to be in retreat across much of Europe by the 1930s, replaced by authoritarian regimes of left or right. Economic chaos followed the war. Germany experienced hyperinflation in 1923, wiping out the savings of the middle class and creating lasting economic trauma. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, caused worldwide suffering and political instability. The economic order established before 1914 never fully recovered. The war had demonstrated that modern industrial economies could be harnessed for total war, a lesson that would be applied again with even more devastating effect in the next great conflict, Far from creating a lasting peace, the settlement after World War I contained the seeds of future conflict. German resentment over Versailles created a nationalist backlash that Adolf Hitler would exploit. Italian resentment over not receiving promised territories drove Mussolini's aggressive foreign policy. Japanese resentment over not being treated as an equal great power contributed to Asian tensions. The artificial borders in the Middle East and Eastern Europe created ethnic conflicts that simmer today. The peace settlement satisfied no one and guaranteed nothing. The war accelerated technological change in ominous directions. Tanks and aircraft, primitive in 1914 to 18, would dominate the next war. Chemical weapons, though eventually banned, demonstrated that science could create weapons of mass destruction. Submarines had shown that civilian shipping was vulnerable to attack. Strategic bombing, barely developed in World War I, would devastate cities in World War II. The Great War was the first truly modern war, but it would be surpassed in destructiveness by its sequel. The war also planted seeds of imperial collapse. Colonies that had provided troops and resources for their imperial masters began questioning why they remained subordinate. Indian nationalists pointed to India's massive contribution to Britain's war effort as justification for self-government. African and Arab peoples who had fought for freedom from Ottoman or German rule wondered why they remained under British or French control. The principle of self-determination, however imperfectly applied in Europe, was an idea that colonized peoples would not forget. Within 20 years, the world was at war again. The Second World War was, in many ways, a continuation of the first. Unfinished business, grievances unresolved, problems created by the peace settlement of 1919. Hitler rose to power on promises to overturn Versailles. The League of Nations failed to stop aggression in Manchuria, Ethiopia, and Spain. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Europe plunged back into war. This conflict, even more destructive than the last, the Great War, the war to end all wars, had instead paved the road to greater catastrophe. Today, the battlefields of the Great War are peaceful again. The trenches have been filled in, the shell holes grassed over. Farmers work fields where millions once fought and died. Towns destroyed in the war have been rebuilt. The physical scars have mostly healed. But the war's impact on history, politics, and human consciousness remains profound. The world we inhabit today was shaped by decisions made between 1914 and 1918. We remember the Great War not to glorify it, but to understand it, and to ensure we learn from it. The men who fought did so with courage and endurance that commands respect, even when their cause or their leaders were flawed. They were ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, trying to survive and do their duty. Their sacrifice should not be forgotten, even as we recognize the futility of much that was demanded of them. In cemeteries across Europe, hundreds of thousands of white crosses and headstones mark the graves of those who fell. Many bear the inscription, "Known unto God," unidentified remains of soldiers whose names are lost. These graves are a testament to the war's terrible cost. They remind us that behind the statistics and strategies, the maps and movements, were individual human beings, sons and fathers, brothers and husbands, each with their own hopes and dreams, all cut short by war. Many nations established tombs of the unknown soldier after the war, a representative of all those who died, chosen from among the unidentified dead. These tombs became focal points for national grief and remembrance. They symbolize all who fell in the war, known and unknown, and serve as reminders of war's cost. They ask us to remember, to honor sacrifice, and to work for peace. What lessons does the Great War teach us? That war is not glorious, but horrific. That modern technology can multiply destruction beyond imagination. That once great powers commit themselves to conflict, it becomes nearly impossible to step back from the brink. That peace is precious and must be actively built and maintained. That the price of war is paid not just by soldiers, but by entire societies for generations. Yet despite the lessons of the Great War, humanity has not learned to avoid war. Conflicts continue across the globe. New technologies create new possibilities for destruction. Nationalism and ethnic hatred still drive violence. The challenges that led to war in 1914, competing nationalisms, alliance systems, arms races, failure of diplomacy, remain relevant today. Understanding the Great War helps us recognize these patterns and perhaps avoid repeating them. But there is also hope. The European Union, unthinkable in 1918, has helped ensure that former enemies now work together peacefully. International institutions, though imperfect, provide forums for resolving disputes. Democratic values have spread, though they remain contested. Nuclear weapons, paradoxically, may have made great power war too costly to contemplate. We have not achieved lasting peace, but we have avoided another conflict on the scale of the world wars so far.